Okay, this is question 4 in the packet. 2019, number 4 is where it originally came from. This was a straight up hypothesis test beginning to end. Specifically, it was a 2-proportion z-test. But there was a slight trick to it. We'll get to that in a minute. So sections 1, 2, and 3 are scored as essentially correct, partially correct, or incorrect. So essentially correct if they satisfy component 1 and 4 and at least one of the remaining components. This is kind of a weird way to do it. Hypotheses imply equality of proportions in the null hypothesis and correct direction in the alternative hypothesis, which utilize an appropriate population parameter in words or symbols. Okay, so here I implied the equal to. P1 is less than P2, where P1 is the population proportion of cochia plants resistant to glyphosate in 2014, and P2 is the population proportion of cochia plants resistant to the thing in 2017. This is my first component. We needed the hypotheses and then the description. Identifies parameters that are population proportions. So population, or you could have said proportion of all cochia plants, or you could have said true proportion of cochia plants. Both parameters are correctly defined as proportions of resistant plants in 2014 and 2017. So resistant in 2017, resistant in 2014. The 2-sample z-test for proportions is identified by name or by formula. So I identified it as a 2-proportion z-test. The proper name is a 2-sample z-test for a difference of 2 proportions, or just 4 proportions, but this works. So in this case, the name and the hypotheses were scored together. A lot of times, the name is scored with the assumptions, but not this time. So those two together are section 1, which I have everything for. So again, you had to satisfy components 1 and 4. So you had to have the hypotheses, and you had to have the name. But then if you were missing 2 or 3, they still gave you credit, at least one of the remaining components. So if you missed out the population proportion, or if you didn't say the resistant part, they were nice and they didn't take off there. Partially correct if the response does not meet the requirement for E, but at least 2 of the components are satisfied. So if you have at least 2 of those components, then you get a partially correct. Incorrect if you don't get E or P. Note, here are all the different ways to define the proportions or the hypotheses. I used, oh goodness. It looks like they also accepted not equal to for HA. Oh, no, these are incorrect. Sorry. These are correct. These are incorrect. So I started with 14 and then I did 17. So I have the one that's listed up above. Oh, right here, 14 is less than 17. You also could have done 17 is greater than 14 or the difference here. And then the null would be, we only did equal to. There are situations where they consider it to be less than or equal to or greater than or equal to like that. But we did not do that. Don't try to do that now. But you could see that again in a different class. Section 2 is scored as follows. Notes use of random samples in 2014 and 2017 satisfies the random condition. So 2 independent SRSs, 1 in 2014, 1 in 2017. Checks for approximate normality of the test statistic by showing the expected number of resistant and non-resistant COCHIA plants are both larger than some commonly accepted criterion, which means 5 or 10. So you should have done the n times p and the n times 1 minus p for both proportions, like so. And then you could have done greater than or equal to 5 or greater than or equal to 10. You also could have converted this to a fraction first. We had to convert it to a fraction for the calculations, but you could have converted it before you did the assumptions. That would have been totally fine. So if you had used the 17/61 and the 20/52, that works. Notes the population of COCHIA plants must be extremely large in both years, thus satisfies the independence condition, 10%. I didn't check that, but it says you have to satisfy component 1 and 2, and then at least one of the remaining components. So I don't have component 3, but I did report a correct value of the z-test statistic. Let's just make sure. Oh gosh. So 2.21. No. Using the pooled estimate. I don't like this scoring guideline. Okay, looks like I got the wrong number. Okay, I must have mistyped something because I have the wrong z-score and the wrong p-value. I'm gonna pause. Okay, so I just paused to check. I definitely mistyped something because I just typed in the exact same numbers and got a different answer. So I'm glad I double checked. Okay, so remember here you had to convert the p-hats into fractions before you can use the fancy calculator feature. So hopefully you remembered how to do that. And then remember you have to use the whole number, not the decimal. So this runs to 12/61 and 20/52. When you type this in, if you did it the way I did, you should have gotten -2.2095 and 0.0136 for your z-score and p-value. But if you did it the other way, where you started with the 2017 and then you did the 2014, which is what they did, then you would have gotten positive 2.2095. So negative or positive, whichever way is fine, as long as your p-value is correct and you're consistent with your hypothesis. I wanted to start with 14, but you could have started with 17 since it said 17 was higher. Okay, now let's go back to the scoring and see what happens as a result. So there were 5 components. I had component 1 and 2, but then I had 4 and 5 wrong. I didn't have 3 at all, but that's okay because you need at least 2 of the following components. So I did not have that, but you would have needed 1 and 2 for sure, and then at least 2 of the remaining ones. So even though you missed component 3, most likely, since we haven't been doing it, you had component 4 and 5. So there's no need to do 3, it won't be required. Partially correct if the response does not meet the criteria for an E, but it satisfies at least 2 of the 5. So I satisfied 1 and 2, so I would get a partially correct here, even though my calculations were completely wrong. Because I typed them in wrong and not because I don't know what I'm doing. Section 3. Okay, there are a lot of notes here that you can read if you want. Section 3 is scored as follows. Provides correct justification of the conclusion based on a correct comparison between a stated p-value and an alpha value of 0.05. So in this case, they told us alpha was 0.05, so you didn't also have to define it. But typically you want to write down what value you're using for alpha, or else write alpha here. Here we didn't need to because it was given in the question. You could have just said alpha. Provide correct justification of the conclusion based on a correct comparison between a stated p-value and a correct value of alpha. So my p-value was wrong, however, which made my conclusion technically wrong, but it is correct based on my p-value. So that would be correct. But if you had the right p-value, which I imagine you did, since the p-value is less than A, we reject HO. Should be your first line. Provide a correct conclusion consistent with the alternative hypothesis. I said there is not, which was consistent with my p-value, so I have it right, but you should have said there is sufficient evidence to say that there has been an increase in the proportion of all Kochia, blah, 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 blah. The conclusion is stated in context. Yes, I definitely have the context there. So even though my p-value was wrong, I still get an essentially correct on the conclusion. So even though p-value was wrong, my answer was right based on that incorrect p-value. So I still get essentially correct here. As would you, which is why if you can't figure out how to make the p-value, how to find the p-value, make it up. Partially correct if you satisfied component 1 and 2, or 2 and 3, or 1 and 3 based on a p-value from section 2. Okay. So if you get it backwards, they gave you partial. Yep, here it is right here. If the conclusion is consistent with a reasonable but incorrect p-value from section 2 and is presented in context of justification based on the comparison of a p-value to the level of significance, then section 3 is scored as an E. I don't think anything else is important right now. Now, alternatively, you actually could have done a confidence interval. I doubt any of you did, but if you did a 2-proportion confidence interval, then pull up the scoring guideline. You also could have done a chi-score test for homogeneity. Again, I very much doubt that any of you did that, but if you did, pull up the scoring guideline to read it. So they decided to group this as 3 sections instead of as 4 sections. So same as the others, the others that had 3 E's is a 4 out of 4, EEP is a 3 out of 4, EEI EPP, EPI, or PPP are 2 out of 4. EII, PPI is 1 out of 4. PII, or all I's, is 0 out of 4. Okay, question was more trouble than it should have been.